Chapter 37. I told Lupe the next day about bumping into Jason's mom at the mall. "So what'd you do?" she asked. "Nothing. We just left," I said. She looked surprised. "You think we'd hang out with her?" I asked. "I don't know," she shrugged. "Maybe you guys went shopping together. Aren't you guys always trying to find a good deal?" I hated it when she lumped me and Jason together. "It's not guys, it's guy, singular," I told her. "I like a good deal, sure, but I don't screw people over." Lupe looked at the ground and didn't say anything. I started to feel bad, but I didn't apologize. I needed her to know that Jason and I were not the same. In class, we had wrapped up our China unit, thank God, and moved on to other countries in Asia. "Who can tell me another place where a lot of things are manufactured, besides Asia?" Mrs. Douglas asked. A hand shot up. "Canada?" someone from the front row asked. "Mexico," Mrs. Douglas announced, ending the guessing pretty quickly. I glanced over at Lupe, who looked like she wanted to crawl under her desk. "Many of the factories there are called maquiladoras, and they make things for cheap," Mrs. Douglas explained. "How cheap?" another kid asked. "Very cheap," Mrs. Douglas said. She told us that at some maquiladoras, workers made as little as 50 cents an hour. This struck me as hugely unfair, and I immediately raised my hand. "How can they pay their workers so little?" I asked Mrs. Douglas. "It's supply and demand. Anytime a lot of people want a job and there aren't that many jobs, the salary goes down," Mrs. Douglas said. I thought about Mr. Yao's comment when we first came, about how 10,000 other immigrants would take our job in 2 seconds if we quit. "Okay, kids," Mrs. Douglas announced. "We're going to play a little game. It's called Hot Seat." That got my classmates' attention. They all sat up straighter in their seats, only to slump back down seconds later when they realized Hot Seat was an educational game, not a game. Here's the way Hot Seat worked. Mrs. Douglas picked someone at random to represent the maquiladoras. That person had 10 minutes to prepare his or her opening statement. Then they had to sit in the hot seat and answer tough questions from the floor. The rest of the class was the floor. "The harder the question, the better," Mrs. Douglas said. With that, she reached into her hat of names and pulled out a piece of paper. "Jason Yao," she announced. Jason groaned. Slowly, he pulled out his pencil and started writing out his statement. While I sat next to him, jaw locked, eyebrows furrowed, he was going down. "Good morning. My name is Jason Yao, and I represent the maquiladoras of Mexico." My hand shot up in the air. "Hey," Jason protested. "I'm not even done reading my statement yet." "Fine," I said. I put my hand down and waited with bated breath for him to finish. Jason droned on about how big his factories were and how many t-shirts and umbrella stands they made every year. As soon as he finished, my hand shot back up. "How does it feel to squeeze your workers for every last cent they have?" I asked. "I don't squeeze anyone," Jason said. "You pay your workers 50 cents an hour. I'd call that squeezing," I said. I glanced at Mrs. Douglas, who gave me the thumbs up sign to keep going. "They don't have to work for me. Nobody's forcing them to," Jason said with a shrug. "But they don't have a choice. They have to feed their family," I said. "Well, that's their problem," Jason said. My classmates' heads bounced from Jason to me like it was a tennis match. "What if you were in their position?" I asked Jason. "If I were in their position, I'd appreciate having a job," he said. He looked hard at me. "Wouldn't you?" My cheeks burned. I glanced at Lupe. As usual, her mouth was clamped shut. I turned back to Jason. "You need them just as much as they need you," I said. "Without them, you wouldn't have a factory." "Yeah, so?" "So why don't you pay them more?" I yelled. "Why do you always have to take from them? Take, 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 take." Every time I said take, I lunged forward in my seat. The other kids joined in, and soon everyone was chanting, "Take, take, 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 take." "It's not my fault," Jason shrieked. "It's supply and demand. Mrs. Douglas, help!" Mrs. Douglas stepped in and took over, freeing Jason from the hot seat. As Jason crawled back to his seat, Mrs. Douglas turned to me and said, "Boy, that was really something. Well done, Mia. I had no idea you were so passionate about maquiladoras." I didn't either. I caught up to Lupe after school. "Hey, how come you didn't help me back there?" I asked her. Lupe shrugged. Didn't look like you needed my help, she said. She turned and started walking home. I felt the sting of rejection. What was up with her? I wondered if it had anything to do with what I said earlier, when I chewed her out for lumping me and Jason in the same category. Had I gone too far? I kicked the rocks on the side of the road and decided to take the long way home. About halfway back, I wandered into a shopping plaza where there was a Pizza Hut calling to me at the end of the buildings. I stopped and peered in. Usually just looking into a restaurant filled me up. All those smiley people, families sitting down for a delicious meal together. We didn't get to eat out much in China because family meals were usually at my grandmother's house. But the few times we did go out, it was pretty funny. In China, people do not split the bill. It's considered very rude to do so, or to not pay for a friend. As a result, people routinely got into fistfights in restaurants as customers pushed and shoved one another for the bill. As a kid, I remember it being hilarious to sit there and watch grown people fighting. Sometimes the fighting got so bad, the waiters and waitresses would have to squeeze in and break it up. Sometimes it would take a whole pack of waitresses just to pin down one person. There was absolutely none of that going on at Pizza Hut that day. Everybody was very civil. There was no shouting and no fighting. People were splitting the bill right down the middle. I guess that's because in America, it's to each his own. Maybe that was why Lupe didn't stand up for me. Maybe it had nothing to do with what I said about me and Jason.